Good evening, everybody. We might get started. That's okay. A punctual start might mean a punctual end. But I just want to say a few words before we begin tonight's events. So thank you all for joining us. I think we're all really pleased to see so many colleagues within the department and visitors outside of the department here to celebrate this event. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to what we hope will be a new tradition in the Department of Education, our recognition of distinction inaugural professorial lectures. So tonight we are celebrating two of our colleagues who were awarded professorships by the University of Oxford in 2025. So Professor Maya Chankseliani and Professor Velda Elliott. With the fast pace of activity that often happens within this university, I think it's quite, when we move from one teaching and research task to the next, I think it's quite nice that we pause for a moment to recognize the achievements of others and others around us. And that's what we're hoping to do tonight. So an event like this gives us a chance to do exactly that, to celebrate the intellectual contributions, leadership, and scholarly communities that our colleagues have built over many years. So the recognition of distinction title marks a significant milestone in one's academic career. So the title of professor marks a culmination of activities which are carefully crafted over one's academic career, acknowledging excellence in teaching, research, and service, and perhaps most importantly, the influence that scholars have on the fields and the communities within which they work. And so we're very proud that Maya and Velda have achieved this mark of distinction, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to hear directly tonight from them about their work. There are plenty of seats at the front, if you don't mind. Please do. One of the things that I really particularly enjoy about this event tonight, which brings together Maya and Velda's work, is that the two lectures tonight illustrate the remarkable breadth of scholarship within the Department of Education. As you'll hear, the topics are quite different. They're spanning international higher education and literary education, yet both speak to the ways that education shapes how we understand the world and our place within it. So for our first lecture, it will be delivered by Maya, Professor of Comparative and International Education and Governing Body Fellow at St. Edmund's Hall. So Maya's research explores the public role of higher education, how universities contribute to social, economic, and political development, and how international engagement shapes institutions and societies across different contexts. So following Maya's lecture and a short Q&A, we will then hear from Professor Velda Elliott, Professor of English and Education. Velda's research focuses on the teaching, learning, and assessment of literature in secondary education, which I'll introduce during the transition. So after both lectures, we'll conclude with an evening of refreshments and continue the conversation out there. So without further ado, so thank you for affording me this introduction. I would like to introduce Maya.
Thank you, Heath. Velda and I first met when we were doctoral students, so it means a great deal for me to share this occasion with Velda. It is a privilege to be standing here today at this department after being here for 14 years since 2012, and to do this at the completion of my book, which is called Seeing Otherwise, International Higher Education and the Possibility of Change, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press later this year. I want to begin this talk with a question that has guided this research. What happens when people cross borders to learn and then return? In different ways, many of us in this room have lived a version of this question. It sits at the intersection of education, politics, mobility, and human judgment. It has become newly charged. International students are now framed in many countries as risks rather than contributors, as problems to be managed rather than learners to be taken seriously, as economic units rather than thinking subjects. Mobility itself is treated with suspicion. Universities are drawn into this shift often reluctantly, sometimes complicitly. And yet people continue to move. They continue to study elsewhere, and they continue to return. And they carry something back with them. The research asks what that something is, how it forms, and what it allows when people return to systems which are often resistant, slow, and openly hostile to change. Much of the existing scholarship on international student mobility has focused on how mobility is shaped by policy and geopolitical context, how students navigate higher education systems, and how international studies linked to differential outcomes for graduates. This work has shown how access to mobility is structured and unevenly distributed across borders, and how global hierarchies of knowledge and legitimacy are sustained. I build on those literatures. But there is something else that these bodies of work often struggle to capture. They offer powerful accounts of systems, power, and constraints, but give slightly less sustained attention to the reasoning subject. The person who compares and reflects, the person who learns something abroad and decides what to do with it subsequently. What is often missed is an account of how people judged as deliberating subjects rather than as products of systems alone. How they weigh responsibilities, risks, norms, and assess what is acceptable or worth persisting with. Judgment, that I mentioned a few times, judgment does not end in the moment it is made. What matters is the stance that carries that judgment over time. To name that stance, I introduced the concept of presence. Presence is a sustained relational stance through which individuals remain oriented to others, to institutions, and to public life over time under constraint. It is the footing from which action or restraint is carried forward. It involves comparative awareness, attentiveness to what is at stake in their settings, and endurance, keeping commitments when institutions do not move. It can be cultivated through international education, particularly through comparison and dissonance. It takes shape and endures through how individuals carry that stance into post-return life over time. This concept is embedded and influenced by Margaret Archer's critical realism and draws on Soren Rieder's concept of patiency to account for why presence often takes the form of endurance and restraint rather than visible action. Presence is related to agency, but it is not the same thing. Agency is more about deciding and acting, while presence is about sustaining answerability over time when action is constrained. This study, what I'm presenting today, drew on a larger international project involving more than 700 interviews across educational, professional, and youth mobilities. The project was funded by the US Department of State and conducted here at this department. The analysis I focus on today is based on in-depth interviews from 391 participants, internationally educated returnees, and a small comparison group of 31 non-mobile peers across 69 countries. So I do not talk about professional or youth mobilities, only student mobility participants. The interviews were conducted in 12 languages by a team of postdoctoral researchers based here at the department and cover Africa, East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Eurasia, the Near East, the Western Hemisphere, and the South and Central Asia. Now, this study did not aim for statistical representativeness, but for analytical depth and conceptual clarity grounded in lived experience of participants. Returnees were selected because they were engaged in different ways in public, institutional, or civic life after return. The non-mobile peers had not studied abroad, but were engaged in comparable public and institutional work. The study paid close attention to formation as a process, how people learned, what unsettled them, and how those shifts that they experienced abroad traveled back home. A few examples might make this concrete. I will begin in Asia. One interviewee, a mental health practitioner, studied psychology in a neighboring Asian country. This interviewee requested anonymity, therefore I will not mention their gender or the country of origin. They described a rural background where they worked as a village official to save tuition for graduate study. Living and learning abroad in a neighboring Asian country mattered for them enormously because they said it pulled them out of familiar assumptions about rural life and professional responsibilities. Their international education drew on humanistic psychology and action research, combining practice with sustained self-reflection and attention to the practitioner's own position. Quote, "We were learning barefoot on wooden floors. They were constantly urging me to reflect. What does this mean for you? What does it mean for the people you are working with?" They recalled how their mentor challenged their tendency of seeing countryside mainly as a place of poverty, insisting that rural life held both sweetness and sourness and included everyday joys, relationships, and ways of living that also shaped life there. These experiences mattered when they returned. What traveled back was a new way of seeing, as they described, slower judgment, less certainty, and a refusal to treat people as cases rather than lives. They went on to work in rural marginalized areas in their home country, supporting families affected by severe mental illness. Their approach centered not only on patients, but on their entire families. They combined home visits and case management with practical work to keep children in school and prevent dropout. Quote, "It was like holding a bamboo basket to fetch water." They used this image to describe working within deep structural limits, where much of what was done slipped away. Presence here means remaining engaged under structural constraint, accepting partial outcomes, and refusing to withdraw even when the work feels fragile and incomplete. The next example moves us to Japan, a well-resourced system where constraint is not material shortage, but habit. One interviewee from Japan studied counseling and special education in the United States. She was a public sector school teacher, raising a child while studying. As a student in the US, she encountered a form of higher education that differed sharply from her prior experiences in Japan. Seminar discussions required her to speak, justify her views, and participate actively, even when language and cultural norms made this difficult. Learning moved away from listening and memorization toward application, problem solving, and independent work. She attended meetings with parents and advocates and observed how educational decisions were discussed and justified in this new setting. At the same time, she experienced the education system from another angle. Her daughter attended a local elementary school. Through volunteering and daily contact with this school in the United States, she observed how students were treated publicly. She noted that school assemblies focused on encouragement and recognition, and contrasted this with assemblies at home that centered, as she said, on correction and scolding. As she put it, they look for the positive aspect, and you are great, they give them an award. This experience has stayed with her. On return to Japan, she drew directly on what she has seen. In her own teaching, she encouraged students to ask questions, work independently, and engage in project-based learning. She advised colleagues on using digital tools to support student autonomy and research-based work, drawing on approaches she had encountered as a student. She also spoke openly about the limits of change, noting that established teaching habits were very slow to shift. It is really difficult to change the way teachers teach, she said. Presence here takes the form of staying with everyday educational practice. She continues to model alternative ways of teaching and learning inside a stable, well-resourced system, even when change is incremental. The next example moves us to public discourse, showing how international study can make certain forms of questioning visible and legitimate within society's academic and public life. So this interviewee is a Dutch scholar and public intellectual, completed her doctoral education in the US in the late 1980s. In the Netherlands, she grew up in a migrant family of modest means. She explained that her study in the US was fundamental for her ability to analyze Dutch society because it exposed her to an academic environment where race, power, and inequality were named and debated in ways that she had never encountered at home. Reflecting on this experience, she explained that studying in the United States allowed her to look at the Netherlands with some kind of distance and criticality. She contrasted this with Dutch universities, where she said race just was not a thing, even though gender and class were openly discussed. This comparative exposure reshaped what she felt compelled to do on return to her home country. Back in Netherlands, she began analyzing her own society through this lens, asking why a country with a long colonial history continued to deny the issues of race and racism. This work culminated in her book, which disrupted a long silence, brought race and colonial history into the public agenda, and despite resistance, gave many people a language to talk about race, especially those who had long sensed inequality but lacked the terms to name it. As she described it, the book was really like a stone in a pond in the Netherlands. Presence here takes the form of sustained intellectual engagement, remaining in a society reluctant to have certain conversations, holding that space open despite resistance. The final example I want to bring raises a slightly different question. What happens when someone formed this way reaches a position of real power? One Peruvian interviewee studied in the UK and later in the United States. She emphasized that both experiences were funded through scholarships, as her father was a state employee who could not have paid for overseas study. She said studying abroad taught her to question authority and to treat truth as something that must be actively pursued. As she put it, what I learned in England was to question and constantly test the process. Reflecting on her later study in the US, she added, practically no one has the truth. The truth is constantly sought. She spoke about learning in settings where students were required to justify their claims and where uncertainty was treated as a condition of serious thought rather than failure. This became habits of judgment that stayed with her. On return to Peru, she entered public life and held various senior positions, including Prime Minister of Peru. But when asked which role mattered most to her, she said, the one that was closest to my heart was when I was the ombudsman. She said ombudsman. In that role, she traveled what she called a poor Peru, meeting families affected by decades of violence and state abandonment. She shared poverty stopped being a number, it became a life. Now I'll bring a quote in which she captured her work back in Peru. I always said that for me it was like a train and the cars. I felt that I was with my feet in one car and my hands holding onto the other, and I did not allow the last car to be left behind. What enabled her to act in this way, she reflected, was not only authority, but habits of judgment formed through international study, refusing to lower standards, insisting on justification, and knowing when to speak forcefully and when to exercise restraint. Presence here takes the form of moral stamina, I would say, staying with those left behind when justice cannot be fully delivered. Taken together, these 4 cases show that international education can unsettle what once seemed normal. It can involve comparison and disorientation. What was unsettled was not simply knowledge, but the grounds on which people judged institutions, authority, and responsibility. Formation does not end abroad. It is tested through return, where cross-border comparison becomes consequential, and where judgment is exercised within the constraints of familiar settings. What matters is not simply what people learn, but how they translate what they learned into practice. Let me pause here because this is where I think the argument is most easily misunderstood. These examples could be misread as evidence of a linear progression from learning to engagement and impact, but this is not the argument. What the research shows instead is something slower and more contingent. People come to see differently and then decide how or whether to act on what they now see. So let me focus now on how that process of seeing otherwise actually takes shape across the interviews. In these interviews that we conducted, one pattern was clear. People rarely pointed to a single moment or a single lecture or a single tutor or a textbook that transformed them. Formation was a cumulative process. It unfolded through sustained exposure to cross-border difference. In seminar rooms, in student residences, in work placements, and many different spaces that they were part of. This is close to what Simon Marginson has described as student self-formation, the reflexive shaping of the self through immersion in knowledge and relational experience, both inside and outside the classroom. Pedagogy mattered, obviously. Seminar discussions, being expected to speak, being challenged by peers rather than corrected by authority, rewarding reasoning over recall, requiring public justification. All these practices demanded that people exercise their own judgment. Over time, this is what built this habit. But formation also happened beyond the classroom, through international housemates and student societies, through volunteering and everyday encounters. They observed how disagreement was handled, who was listened to, and how rules were applied or bent. These encounters exemplify what Gerd Biesta calls subjectification, becoming a responsive subject through being addressed by others, often without the scripts that home contexts had made available. Dissonance mattered deeply. When moments when things did not fit, when assumptions stopped working, when familiar ways of understanding education, authority, social relations were unsettled through cross-border comparisons that they were experiencing. When people realized that what they had taken as natural was in fact contingent. This is where Mesiro's idea of disorienting dilemma is helpful, but here it operated as a process rather than as a single moment of disorientation. Disorientation came in waves, intellectual, ethical, emotional, and often persisted through repeated encounters during prolonged periods of international study. And what mattered enormously was comparison. Holding systems against each other, norms against norms, expectations against expectations. Through comparative reframing, individuals came to see their own institutions, their own norms and assumptions from outside. This comparative awareness allowed them to return home and recognize possibilities and constraints in their familiar settings that had previously seemed fixed. Seeing otherwise, however, does not automatically lead to action. The question this research then asks is, what do people actually do with what they have seen? How do they carry it home and into systems that may not welcome their new ways of seeing? Returnees were acutely aware that what they had seen elsewhere could not simply be imported. They talked constantly about limits, who could be persuaded, who would listen, and where resistance would harden. Their actions were therefore selective and often restrained. Engagement involved judgment about timing, scale, and form, as well as decisions about when not to act. In many cases, restraint was not a failure of agency, but a way of keeping their work alive. Sometimes that meant speaking loudly, sometimes it meant holding the last car in place, or working quietly case by case. For context, as I already mentioned earlier, we also interviewed 31 non-mobile peers who did not have international education experiences. Most of them reported absolutely comparable commitment to their societies. What was different was that internationally educated returnees could see their systems from outside. They worked with explicit comparative reference points, drew on transnational relationships, and could hold their own systems at a distance in ways that non-mobile peers, lacking that comparative reference point, often could not. The interviews with returnees point to 5 mechanisms through which international study became consequential in practice. The book expands on these mechanisms in great detail, but I have just a few words for you here. So these 5 mechanisms, what are they? First one is reflexive agency. Returnees reported development of reflexive agency, perhaps not always in those words, but as we analyzed, we saw enormous evidence of reflexivity, the capacity to judge what was possible and what was not, and to act accordingly under constraint. International study also sharpened their civic understanding, a sense of where harm was occurring and who bore responsibility for it. They learned also to translate knowledge across contexts, carrying what they had encountered abroad into settings that they knew a lot about, but into settings also that did not welcome that new knowledge very often. Next mechanism is transnational relations that sustained both their perspective and their support over time. And finally, they developed intercultural understanding, the ability to work across difference in ways that others around them often could not. What holds all of this together is presence, a stance of comparative awareness and endurance that keeps people engaged with others, with institutions, and with constraint, even when outcomes are uncertain. It is what makes it possible to keep working from within while seeing otherwise. And the final slide. Now, at a time when international students are increasingly treated as instruments of economic gain and objects of security concern, valued for revenue and scrutinized for risk, this research offers a slightly different story. International education can form people who learn to see otherwise and carry comparative judgment back into societies and institutions they inhabit. It reminds us that international higher education forms the person as a judging subject, not merely as a skilled practitioner. Through comparison, distance, and dissonance, it shapes how individuals interpret authority, recognize injustice, assess responsibility, and decide when and how to act. These effects are often slow, uneven, and politically inconvenient, but they are nonetheless consequential. But the argument has limits, and I want to name them. Formation through international education is not always emancipatory. Hungary's Prime Minister Orban studied at Oxford. Georgia's, my home country, Prime Minister Kobachidze holds a doctorate from Düsseldorf. Both returned with international credentials and used them to consolidate power, to restrict civic space, and to narrow democratic possibility in their own home countries. International education provides vocabulary, institutional fluency, and symbolic legitimacy, but it cannot always determine how these are used. Nor is what people encounter while studying abroad is always what it claims to be. Some returnees from the United States, just a handful, but still, a number of returnees in our study, described a gap between the liberal ideals they were taught before going abroad and the pressures they experienced to conform, to mute their faith, to align with dominant norms. So dissonance ran in both directions. Access to international higher education also remains deeply unequal, shaped by socioeconomic status, class, geography. And finally, contribution does not require return. Many internationally educated people act across borders, contributing both to their home societies from abroad and to the societies in which they live. Presence is therefore not always anchored in location. I want to end where I began. What happens when people cross borders to learn and then return? They do not transform systems overnight. Often they are constrained, often they compromise, very often they persist quietly. What they carry back is the capacity to remain present to judgment under constraint, a way of seeing otherwise that endures long after study has ended and keeps open the possibility of change. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for very thought-provoking insights into international education. We have a few minutes for questions before we'll turn over to the next lecture. So I'd like to open it up to the audience.
Do you mind if I open the door a little?
Yes, you need to. Let me do that, and you will take we will take a question from Rachel.
Trying to escape this.
We'll try to get some air coming through here.
A lovely talk. I'm just curious, when you think about the kind of dissonance, the comparison, can also be kind of experienced and affected in the kind of national context. Because I guess, you know, higher education is typically thought of as kind of a diverse space, even if it's attended by only national students. And the argument is made that through that kind of encounter with diversity that students are synthesized. So would you see that kind of domestic process as qualitatively different from the kind of international process that you're talking about? Or would you see them as kind of interactive?
Thank you. Shall I take it? Or?
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Really great question. It would be really interesting to study that comparatively in an extremely rigid, methodologically very rigid study. I do believe that higher education's impact is enormous, even in domestic settings, obviously, but international higher education is something totally different. First, because of the environment outside the university, first and foremost. And second, very often because of the foreign language in which students study. But there is something that I would like to mention in relation to the question you posed. So talking with UK policymakers, for example, they often say, and when I try to argue and persuade that actually we should have more opportunities for British young people to study abroad. They sometimes say that actually our higher education system is a top quality higher education system in the world, which it is, and it is highly internationalized, which it is. So our British students have already an enormous opportunities to be exposed to international international peers, their knowledges, their perspectives that they bring, and so on and so forth. However, we would need a study probably on British young people who go abroad and who stay here in our brilliant system, very international and so on and so forth. But I do believe that studying elsewhere and being part of a very different system has its own impacts, which cannot be replicated in domestic settings, however much we believe in the impact of higher education, because most of the scholars I mentioned who have written on this, like Gert Biesta and Simon Margits, are really key scholars who have written on the transformation of individual within higher education. Much of their work is also on domestic settings, so we know that it's hugely transformative. However, international part adds something to it. That's my argument. Thank you.
It's a related question, but it's about the role of language, because you've had a lot of different languages in the world represented, and each language is a different way of being.
Yes.
It's not exactly the same, it's a different way of being in a language and beyond just the culture or the academic environment. Could you give us a bit of insight on, like, if you observed any particular contrasts across different language groups and how that might have played out in example?
So I have not looked at this in great detail, but I would like to. There is already so I have been quite interested lately in the impact of novel experiences on humans biologically, on the brain, etc. So there is quite a lot of research how speaking in foreign languages, living in foreign contexts, because of the language differences, actually impacts individuals as novel settings. So I think that's quite well established in research, that language has huge impact on shaping individuals. I have not yet looked at the differences by language, but I fully agree with you that, you become to a certain extent a different person when you speak that language. And some of us who speak multiple languages know that actually speaking different languages shapes what you say very often, doesn't it? And how you say it. Great question, yes.
Thanks for that presentation of a massive qualitative study and the really careful analysis that you presented. So I followed your journey and I was convinced about the effects of the experiences on the data set that people that you spoke to. And then I was less convinced about one of the limitations that you mentioned. So I want to challenge you on that. So you said that it doesn't necessarily result in emancipatory thinking, and you gave 2 examples. And I wonder why you think that studying abroad and being mobile as a student should affect people's values of politics in that way. It didn't come from your data set that certain set of values.
Okay, yes. Great question. Yes, I have been thinking much more about that question again lately. So I think the secret there lies in taking perspectives more easily. So being more flexible, developing a more flexible mindset, stepping into other people's shoes. So one of the participants said, I think, seeing the world from other windows. So once people have to practice that because they encounter so much difference and so much otherness, at a very intensive scale, those who have been students abroad would agree, once people encounter that, it's a kind of a survival instinct that you have to become flexible. So these novel experiences are so strong, especially when it involves different language, but I would believe not only, even if British students go to Australia or the US, that's very big shock in itself for the brain. And people try to become flexible, try to learn how others think. Now, that can be used in different ways. You can become a very skilled politician, but you can also develop more empathy, more flexibility. And that's part of intercultural understanding in our research, that big construct where we talk about those things. So that is, I think, a kind of a secret there, trying to see the world from other windows, where you have to do that in order to actually survive.
Thank you for taking my question. My name's Helen. Thank you for your talk. My context is I work for the International Baccalaureate in the University Recognition and Government Advocacy space. I'm particularly interested in what you said about inequality of access and thinking about shifts in international student mobility, shifts away from the big five tertiary destinations. So I work with, we're looking at secondary mobility in secondary education into tertiary. So for policymakers and educational organisations, what would you see as the principal kind of next steps to improve or to kind of eradicate inequality of access, to mitigate it?
Yes, that's a really big issue, and it's becoming much more problematic. Looking at the tuition fees, for example, I recently checked what tuition fees for international students are at Oxford, and I was pretty shocked, to be honest, because I do not check it every year, but when I check, I'm startled. So biggest tool would be scholarships, because if it continues this way at this scale, right, raising tuition fees, only people who can afford will come to study here. And that will impact hugely the opportunities for individuals as well as opportunities for their societies.
Thank you.
And then David, and then we might have to change.
Thank you so much, Maya. This is such an important and really, really fascinating study. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm just wondering if amongst your interviewees, there were some who also recounted stories of encountering forms of prejudice or forms of bullying or forms of harassment or forms of cultural discrimination that they hadn't encountered before. What did they do with that, and what did it mean to their self-formation and to what they did upon return?
That's a really great question. So I wrote a little section in the book exactly on that. So we had, I think, 5 or 6 people like that. They were all from the Middle East and studied in America. And they were, I think, all females, if I'm not mistaken. So you can think, so that was largely about gender and about religious habits. So they did not expect that what they learned in the classrooms and what they knew about the United States before going there would be so different from what they thought was expected from them to do, what the society expected them to do. They described those experiences as hugely formative for them, while it was deeply disturbing for them to see this dissonance again. It was hugely formative for them to develop their reflexive and critical understanding of those settings that they now saw from a totally different perspective. So they described those in the as experiences that were hugely, enormously formative.
Okay, got one more question, and while we're answering this one, we might get the next.
Hey, Maya, thank you very much. And really very sort of accounts of why international.
Yes, did you hear Soren Reader? I mentioned I learned about her work from you.
Oh.
Yes. Nobody knows about her. She's great. Her writing on patience.
Well, I'm going to ask a much more pragmatic question, which is also probably a hot question. We were funded by the US State Department. Are they? How is that? How is that? We laugh, but it's awful. I mean, what's your sense of what's going to happen to that conversation in the US about the future of scholars?
Nothing good in the next few years, but I'm sure things will improve. Let's continue as they are now. Yes, but since Trump came into power, we just stopped all contact. They were not allowed to talk to us.
Hopefully the archivists will tell the truth at some point.
Yes, and all the output that will come out of this project will hopefully be read by future politicians.
It makes it even more timely.
Might have some study abroad experiences, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Apologies about the air situation. I think we've gone the opposite direction. I see people reaching for their coats. We can try to make a few adjustments. Apologies. We've actually got, I just counted, we've got 61 people. So I think that's contributing to some of the imbalance in the air. And at one count there, we had 55 online. So it's a fantastic turnout. Okay, we now move to the second lecture of the evening, which highlights another dimension of the rich research culture within the Department of Education. So our next speaker is Velda Elliott, Professor in English and Education. So Velda's research focuses on teaching, learning, and assessment of literature in secondary education. Her book, Knowledge in English, Canon, Curriculum, and Cultural Literacy, received the UKLA Academic Book Award in 2022. So Velda's lecture this evening is titled Considering Context Through Shelley's England 1819, or How to Murder a Poem and Get Away with It. I turn over to you, Professor Elliott.
I think this is the moment in which I'm allowed a little self-indulgence. So I'm just, if not now, when? I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I think we all know no one gets to this position without being very lucky and having the support of a great many people. And I just want to acknowledge and say thank you, because I have been very lucky in my teachers, my family. My mother's online, but also, and my supervisor, Ingrid's in the room. I'm really pleased to see her here. Colleagues and students, and particularly people who've moved between those categories over the years. So I'm really grateful. Another element of self-indulgence is that I'm going to talk about a poem, and I feel this is very much something completely different at this point. And my title is English and Education. So we're going to start with English, and then the second half will be education. I promise we'll get there. So in late 2022, AQA, the exam board, changed its GCSE cluster of poems, and it introduced a new cluster called Worlds and Lives. And this was intended to diversify the range of poetic voices that were being studied at GCSE. So it has more women in it, it has more working class people, and it has more people of colour in it. But they also did something interesting in that they changed the older poems that are in that cluster of poems as well. So although it was pretty much the same poets that had always been studied, they picked poems that were not necessarily familiar to teachers unless they'd made a particular study of it. And so this is one of them. An old, mad, blind, despised and dying king, princes the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring. Rulers who neither see, nor feel, nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop, blind in blood, without a blow. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field, an army who liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed. A Senate, time's worst statute unrepealed, are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. This is a poem which isn't published in Shelley's lifetime. Mary Shelley included it in her edited collection of his works in 1839, which is when it gets its title. And he writes it initially in a postscript in a letter to his friend Leigh Hunt, who is the editor of a paper called The Examiner. And he sends it on the 23rd of November, 1819. Now, he sent several letters to Leigh Hunt during November 1819, and he wrote, including a very, very lengthy one on November 3rd. And this is a startlingly brief letter by comparison. He introduces his postscript, which is where the poem appears, with the words, "I send you a sonnet. I don't expect you to publish it, but you may show it to whom you please." In other words, please publish it. And the letter seems motivated by two things. The first one is a bit of a query as to why Hunt hasn't replied to his previous letters. "I have no spirits to write about what I do not know whether you will care about. I know well that if I am in great misery, poverty, etc., you would think nothing else but how to amuse and relieve me. You omit me if I am prosperous." And then the other point is the sonnet, and the letter kind of has the same theme as the sonnet. It says, "Oh, what a state England is in," he writes. So he is very clearly locating it in a time and a place, in the same way that Mary Shelley does when she gives it its title 20 years later. Now, when this came in the AQA cluster, it was the first time that I'd encountered this poem. My own English teachers were mainly interested in metaphysical poets, so I did a lot of John Donne, and I had a deeply resentful encounter with Keats at A-level. But reading it, I had a kind of instant vision of how this would be taught in the classrooms that I'm familiar with in schools in England. The current assessment objectives for GCSE English literature include AO3 of 4, and it's 15 to 20% of the marks for GCSE show understanding of the relationships between texts and the contexts in which they were written. As a form for the study of English literature, this is coherent with Wilder's identification of context as one of the fundamental topoi of contemporary literary criticism, and with Hayot's argument that almost everyone now thinks new historically. But in English education, an overly heavy focus on contextual detail, particularly historical contextual detail, has been criticised. For example, Robert Eagleson talks about secondary English teaching where the historical context is prioritised over how a play works or what comedy is. And associated with this criticism of knowledge and facts-led learning in secondary English literary studies in English education more generally, including me and other people in this room, actually. So, the single sentence of England in 1819, with its stacking of subjects before the eventual R, almost demands that we play I Spy Historical Illusion. I hope you're all familiar with these books. They look different in different countries, I'm aware, so this may not be what you have seen in your youth. And it's particularly important because this is a book, a terrible photo of a book by James Chandler, and it's called England in 1819. It's not about the poem. It takes its title from the poem, but it's about 1819 literature more generally. And Chandler says that, like the literature of the larger period we call Romanticism, but with a particular intensity, English writing from 1819 is aware of its place in and as history. Much literature work of England in 1819, in other words, seems concerned with its place in England in 1819. So we can start playing this game relatively easily. Line 1, the madness of King George. Line 2, the despised Prince Regent, especially if you've seen Blackadder 3. But after that, it quickly becomes much more difficult to identify specific allusions kind of above and beyond a generalised sense of disgust and unhappiness with government. And actually, the ease of identification in that first couple of lines might betray teachers and students as they kind of think, actually, we can carry on do this, and then they can't carry it on. But it's also a mistake to conclude that there is no more specific reference, that it's all now generalised. At least one online revision guide does do that and claims that a people starved and stabbed in the untilled field is a general reference to the impact of the Corn Laws, which therefore misses one of the most one of the major political events in England in 1819, the Peterloo Massacre. So the Peterloo Massacre happens when 60,000 people, which is quite a lot in the 19th century, gather at a rally in St Peter's Field just outside Manchester on August the 16th, and they are protesting the lack of parliamentary representation for the common people, partially because of the artificially high price of bread caused by the Corn Laws, but also they're in an economic slump. It's post-Napoleonic Wars. And so there they are addressed by the radical orator Henry Hunt, and local magistrates ordered the yeomanry to go and arrest him. And instead of kind of being careful and thoughtful about this, instead the yeomanry just charge into the crowd, and they kill 18 people, including women and children, and they injure several hundred more. Now, this is quite an important event in the history of political representation in this country. I didn't learn about it at school. Most people I know didn't learn about it at school, but I hear that it is now on AQA GCSE history, and therefore that matches up with the poem. And it is reassuringly easy to find it if you simply type into the internet, what happened in England in 1819? But there are other things which are less easy to find via an internet search. Like, for example, the use of police informers or agents provocateurs, such as Oliver the Spy, excellent name, and an excellent resource, Representative Poetry Online from the University of Toronto. And they suggest that sanguine laws might be a reference to this. So William J. Oliver, to give him his formal name, worked for the Home Office as an informer and an agent provocateur, identifying and entrapping groups of reformer activists. And we know that this was kind of cared about by poets. The following year, 1820, Charles Lamb writes a poem called The Three Graves, in which Satan becomes the gravedigger for the coffinless and unblessed burial of Oliver the Spy and two other informers. So far, so heavily contextual. The illusions, or even kind of the potential illusions in that last case, are really interesting pieces of British social history, right? They're less well known. They perhaps demonstrate the aptness of studying this poem in the era of the Policing Act of 2022 and the criminalisation of protest in this country. But they aren't perhaps essential pieces of what Barbara Blyman calls door-opening knowledge for producing a meaningful response to or interpretation of the poem, or even for drawing on other work. It's not something that's going to create a stigma if you don't know about the Peterloo Massacre or who Oliver the Spy was. Even if the Peterloo Massacre is also the origin story of the Guardian newspaper, fun fact, a detailed event of the account, such as I have given you here, is probably more than you need in a single lesson on one poem for GCSE examination. And actually, I think most of the early part of the poem doesn't require specific contextual glossing at all. We've got the sentiment of anger that is driving the rhetoric, and the poem can be interpreted basically in that vein. The one thing that does occur to me, and this is the one thing that links back to Maya's talk, is that Shelley is in exile when he writes this. So presence does not always require location. He'd left Britain 18 months earlier, and there's various things that this talk. It reduces the risk of writing a poem like this, even if it doesn't get published. You can see someone who is frustrated with the political situation back home, who is powerless to do anything about it except write poems. Chandler, going back to that lovely book, says that this is it's in the category of writings that seek to state the case of the nation and to do so in a way as to alter its case. But there are other things. I'm quite interested as to what Times Worst statute might be. As a reader. Wikipedia and Cliff's Notes say that this is a reference to the lack of civil rights for Catholics. Shelley is famously a self-proclaimed atheist who probably isn't that bothered about that. I am going to go with James Chandler's interpretation, which is this Parliament. It's as the grammatical construction suggests that it's the Senate, which is Times Worst statute, and that kind of that's saying he's not very interested in the current political approach. I apologise for the smallness of this writing. So basically, Shelley's philosophical position on this question is that Parliament should be abolished entirely in favour of the internal rule of all people over themselves, a rule fostered by the work of poetry's unacknowledged legislators. That's poets. So we should all read a lot of poetry, and that will teach us what we need to know to self-govern ourselves, and all will be well. I got a feeling a bit cynical about that. And then finally, going to the kind of the final line of the poem, the final two lines, talks about this glorious phantom. And in order to get to the glorious phantom, you also have to go back to Shelley's previous writing. So in 1817, he writes a long pamphlet on the death of Princess Charlotte in childbirth, and it ends with this long sentence about the glorious phantom, which is essentially the spirit of liberty arising from its grave. And we should all hope for this. It sounds like an address on the death of Princess Charlotte, address to the people on the death of Princess Charlotte, is going to be about how wonderful she is. And in fact, what he does is really, he puts next to the kind of the public mourning and the general privilege of Princess Charlotte's life, he juxtaposes that with the execution a day later of 3 Luddites who are betrayed by Oliver the Spy. So they had been in the Pentrick Rising. Don't worry, I'm not going to go onto that as historical context. But it just shows that you could kind of carry on daisy chaining historical context as we go further down. But anyway, he claims to be doing a eulogy to a princess, and instead he's actually making the same kind of political claims as he does in England in 1819. I'll do this a lot about the poem. It's all right, we're nearly through the poem. Besides all this contextual knowledge, historical contextual knowledge, there's also the literary contextual knowledge of this poem. So we've got 2 forms here. Those of you may have noticed it's a sonnet, 14 lines, we all know, and it's also a list poem. But in both cases, it's working against the type of its poem. So Burton Mitchich, note that list poems are kind of expected to go in an order. They're supposed to kind of show you the reason for the order they have things in. So that a list of good things goes from better to best, and a list of bad things goes from bad to worst. And instead, he seems to start at the top, and we're not really sure how all of these go together. And maybe the list is out of order, maybe it's scattered, maybe it's a symbol of Shelley's distress, maybe that we could do some delightful literary imagining on this. But the sonnet form is also undermined by this. So Chandler calls this an unprecedented rhyme scheme. For those of you who aren't familiar, I will just say that this is A, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, C, C, D, D. There we go. And that is not a normal sonnet rhyme scheme. And there is the kind of, so the last bit of a sonnet, usually the quatrain in one form, is a kind of reversal of what's gone before. Whereas here, the last, we've got these 2 rhyming couplets at the end. And so lines 11 and 12 are just an extra part of the list, although then lines 13 and 14 do create that kind of reversal, which we might expect. But there's another thing where it's playing against type. All of these woes, the contextual woes, cannot simply be understood as just woes. They've all got inherent contradictions in them. So, and this again, I'm drawing on Chandler, this is not my interpretation. The king's dying. So age is partly responsible for his failings. That's one of the reasons why he's such a bad king, but also it offers hope. He's dying. And within weeks of this poem being written, he is in fact dead. The princes are dregs. They're the most worthless remnants, but they're the last remnants. They're going to be gone. And basically, you can go through all the items in the list this way. But I think one of the most interesting parts of this is the word leech-like. Now, we tend to think of leeches as being extracting blood, kind of draining of resources. Those are the kind of metaphors we use. They drain value. They extract essential resources away from things. But in the 19th century, they were essential medical things. And so you are, so this is an instance where we see the significance of context. It doesn't matter who the particular identities of the kind of targets of Shelley's wrath are, as much as it matters to know that actually leeches are attached to fainting individuals to make things better. This is about improving things. It's about, and this kind of leads us to the overall kind of hope at the end, the hope of the last the hope of the last couplet, and perhaps the overall message. So leeches are important, and I think it's really important that that is a specific single word, and I'll come back to it. Now, for the education half, there you go, you can relax a little bit. Basically, all of those things, thinking about all of that information, I think there are some questions that arise when we're thinking about poems from a pedagogical point of view. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time that I have available. So we're thinking about what kind of context is needed, which context is needed, and when is it given. And unfortunately, or practically, we do have to think how much context is needed to engender a satisfactory account of the poem for an examination situation, because that's the world we're living in. And also that is how they're being taught in a single hour to do this poem with an eye towards their eventual exam. And then I also think that it's really important to think about how we can supply this contextual material in a way that it facilitates personal response rather than encouraging the sense of a logic puzzle to be solved, which we'll come back to. So thinking about those questions, I then went through the kinds of context that I'd found when looking at the poem. Now, this isn't an exhaustive typology of lists of context. It isn't an exhaustive typology of kinds of context, but it is the kinds of context that I've been talking about here. So we have general historical, so leeches. We've got specific historical, Peterloo. We've got specific biographical or intertextual. So, for example, the content of that pamphlet. We've got general biographical information, which I really didn't dwell on very much, but he's a political radical, he's a romantic, he's an exile. And we have the general intertextual or literary. Now, the general biographical category is a bit risky for English teaching because it reflects what's called the biographical fallacy, this idea that when we read poems, we're kind of going, well, let's find out about the life of the poet by reading this poem. And if you put that together with the general historical context, that is the source of the kinds of generalizations that chief examiners write about and complain about in their reports on exams, because it's the kinds of things that cause students to write, in Shakespeare's time, women were very undervalued. And they go, yes, but there was a queen. So can we talk about that a little bit more? So they make these kind of general points which have no bearing on the text. They're not linked to the specificities of the text and its language. But on the other hand, general historical and general intertextual or literary also seem to be the most coherent with the model that is called of background knowledge, or core knowledge as it's called in the States, or the cultural literacy model from E.D. Hirsch, or what is known as cultural capital in very wrong-headed way, as it's been labelled by Gove and Ofsted in this country. Now, I will admit, leeches caused me a bit of an issue here, because I'm not sure whether the medical application of leeches is general or specific in this particular context. Because it could be argued it's specific or historical context because it arises from the use of a word in the text itself, and in doing so, it's functioning as context which is unlocking meaning from the poem. It's providing possible interpretation, it's providing alternative interpretations. It is, in Barbara Blyman's term, door opening. It's opening a door to the poem, but it's also potentially opening other doors. It's useful general knowledge. It applies to a wider field of reference and that kind of wider cultural literacy. And so I am beginning to wonder if this is the perfect piece, the ideal piece of contextual information. It arises from and gives meaning to the text, and it's a worthwhile piece of more general knowledge that can help you work out other metaphors, other texts. Here is a piece of contextual knowledge which is worth having, perhaps more so than the story of Oliver the Spy, maybe just a little bit. And this is coherent with Louise Rosenblatt, who is one of the progenitors of reader response theory, and she talks about context. She says context will have value only when the student feels the need of it and when it's assimilated into the student's experience of particular literary works. So that's offering an answer to that question. What kind of context? When? What kind of context? It needs to be specific. It needs to arise out of the student's need to interpret the text. But it also implies that context should be contingent in the moment. It should be an answer. So it is both which and when. It is specific, the context that they need, and it is as the need arises. Now, one of the issues with this, and this is again why context is of interest to me more generally in English teaching at the moment, is that the rise of cultural literacy, or cultural capital, has driven the pre-teaching of context in English lessons. Now, the arguments in favour of this are drawn from studies which show an increase in reading comprehension and retention based on prior knowledge of the topic or the broad teaching of social studies. So I think it's Tyne and Kaborek, which basically says, if you know about baseball, then you do better when you do a comprehension test on a text about baseball. Yes, okay, it seems really logical. You know, you'll do better on your comprehension test. But I would argue that actually the primary outcome for literary study is not the same as reading comprehension. Literary study and interpretation is not the same as reading comprehension. We do want to know what a poem says, but the primary point is not that efferent meaning, that meaning you can carry away from the classroom. It's about generating a literary interpretation. It's about producing an argument which draws on evidence from the text, from context, and I rather like this this quotation from Bush. It says, "There's too much potential for context to be wielded as a blunt instrument, in my view, when we pre-teach context as content." Pre-teaching context is more efficient. It's especially more efficient if you're using a set of slides as both your lesson plan and your lesson resources, which puts the form of the lesson into this linear progression and the discussion of the poem into linear progression. You put the context at the front, you've dealt with it. They know it. What more is there to know? Teaching it as contingent in the moment requires a lot more of the individual teacher, but I think it's likely to be more powerful in interpreting the poem. In this case, for example, I don't think that the overall comprehension actually depends on specific identification of historical instances as much as it does on the kind of understanding of this as a list poem, which is in the category of polemic. It's a protest poem, and it's got that underlying emotion with it. So this leads me to the question, what are we seeking to achieve in the teaching of poetry? So Fink, who is writing about teaching poetry to undergraduates, offers the viewpoint that through the tracking of allusions in poems, students can develop greater knowledge and fuller understanding of history and culture. And he goes on to reference his own use during the Vietnam War, and in the 2010s, giving undergraduate students poems to read that taught them about the Vietnam War. Now, I'm not going to lie, it is definitely true that one of the joys of kind of reading any kind of literature is that incidental gain of knowledge. I am a nerd. I really enjoyed learning about Oliver the Spy. I do not think it is necessary for 15-year-olds to know about it. And I don't think they'll get quite as much joy out of it either. I will say that the joint sessions we run on our PGCE between English and history interns does suggest that there is perhaps a slightly different standard for historical knowledge between the two disciplines. Sometimes we do have a concerted focus on a historical historical period. So, for example, most children in this country will go and do a unit of First World War poetry, and they will do a set of them all together. And that might kind of create this historical cultural immersion, but it's not really true of the majority of poetry teaching. So, for example, this poem is part of so-called representative romantic poetry of the GCSE specifications. But it's not the same historical context across the board. So this kind of thick historical account is not going to help you when you go to read Emily Bronte's Shall Earth No More Inspire Thee, which is in the same cluster. The kind of intertextual connection suggested by Fink, however, does seem to indicate the potential value of choosing texts that relate to one another, whether that's through intertext or through proximity of chronology. And in doing that, we can strengthen the mental schema that students build about and between texts. But this is moving away from kind of general historical knowledge and towards general literary knowledge. Oh, which might be more to the point in an English classroom. Who knew? I mean, you might, in order to kind of make the particular historical allusions in this in an exam condition, you would need to learn those factual references. But I am not convinced that AQA put this poem on the syllabus because people don't know enough about the Peterloo Massacre. And I could be wrong. New criticism warns us against the temptation to think of the point of literature teaching as the historical knowledge that's gained. So this is a foundational text in new criticism, and Brooks and Warren say, though one may consider a poem as an instance of historical or ethical documentation, the poem in itself, if literature is to be studied as literature, remains finally the object for study. Moreover, even if the interest is in the poem as a historical ethical document, there is a prior consideration. One must grasp the poem as a literary construct before it can offer any real illumination as a document, which reminds me quite a lot of John Guillory's monument document thing going on. Louise Rosenblatt also says background materials already receive much attention in schools and college literature programs. That's in the 1960s. It's published in 1995, but she's talking about the 1960s. The danger, however, is that such study tends to become an end in itself. So even new historicism, from whose tenets the study of literature in its social cultural context has come to dominate school teaching, while we see texts as being inextricably embedded in their context, we are still treating text as the primary focus of study, not the contextual information. And of course, we have another problem, which is once you, as I've demonstrated today, once you start with context, where do you stop? It just goes on and on and on. It's boundless. You can't draw a line around it. I've got another lovely quotation. This is another kind of wonderful thing about English, is that you do lots of quotations, much more than you do in education. Context comes to function less as the recovered slipper for Cinderella's foot, and more as the inadequately single name of an ever-receding horizon, a problem rather than a solution. Definitely a problem rather than a solution. He goes on to ask which history, whose history, what bounds do we impose on boundlessness? And this problem of kind of ever-increasing circles of context returns us to this question of the examination and how much context we need for a poem in an examination situation. I suspect you'll know what I'm going to say from what I've said already, but essentially less. There's a real danger in offering too much context, particularly when we're thinking about literary interpretation. We don't want it to be something which is, the context becomes the thing which is known. And then the literature is illustrative or representative or reflecting, but the context is explaining the literature. It's making that very kind of clear line between the two of them. The context too easily becomes the answer to the poem. I think, actually, the student needs to know that Shelley references a catalogue of political debacle, and they might probably need an example for good measure. But actually, they don't really need to know much more about the precise historical happenings. They need to know about the emotion behind the poem. Is it anger? Is it frustration? You know, you can argue for either of those using the exile, using the tone of the poem. You've got that cascading list as additional evidence. And we might bring in then the literary evidence of the sonnet form, the kind of tightly structured form, which is almost contradicting the kind of overwhelming emotion. And I think that too much context brings us to this problem, a parallel problem to that identified by Robert Eagleston. So he says about metaphor spotting, about feature spotting. For students of literary studies, this process leads to the very mistaken idea that poetry is a kind of basic message to which floral decoration is added, and their job is simply to classify the flowers. Earnestly identifying the historical allusions is just classifying the leaves. So it's this problem of boundless context, coupled with the constraints in the examination, that provoked my title, How to Murder a Poem and Get Away with It. Billy Collins, in his poem Introduction to Poetry, which, by the way, is the most used poem in English education research, far and wide, talks about, he speaks satirically of students tying a poem to a chair and beating it with a hose to find out what it means. I don't think context is torture. But in sufficient quantity, it could be concrete boots. It can weigh a poem down, it can sink it beneath the waves, or it can function as Bush's blunt instrument. There's ample research demonstrating that students have a tendency to consider poems as technical puzzles, as cryptic crosswords to which their teachers hold a piece of information that's slotted incorrectly will enable them to unlock it, some of which has been done by Gary. How can we supply the contextual material in a way that avoids that sense of a logic puzzle to be solved and return the focus to the potential for personal response? Assuming that that's what we're looking for in English education, which I think it probably is. Thomas Fink, suggests that the professor's task is to figure out what would be just too little, just right, and too much information. And that's the Goldilocks formula. It's not just quantity, though. I think it's also quality. It's the right kind of context that we need to find, and that is which arises from and is contingent upon the poem, on the questions the reader has for the poem. And that enables and supports interpretation rather than crushing it. And I hope that I have not, in fact, crushed England in 1819 too much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Velda. I'm happy to open up the audience for questions.
Yeah, thank you. So we have text and we have context, and you've identified lots of different kinds of context. That's been the theme. Do all those different kinds of contexts engage with the text in the same way, or is part of the problem actually there's different kinds of engagement?
I mean, I think there's many more kinds of context as well. There's also there's another thing about if you give context which drives interpretation and which can change the way that you kind of think about the poem. I think part of the issue is that teachers are overwhelmed with the possibility, and there is actually it's always to do with league tables and accountability, and you want something which is predictable, which is controllable, and therefore here is a set of like, did you teach them the content? Yes, I did. Here is the context which I taught them. And we don't really think about too much about what kinds of context are really useful, and that is a problem. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. I had a student on the MLT a few years ago who told me about the knowledge organizer that her department made for a particular poem by Simon Armitage. And one of the pieces of information they had to learn was that Simon Armitage was 39 when he wrote this poem. And you kind of think, I'm not sure. Like, that's a piece of information. You can learn it. How is it going to help you with this poem? You'll have to take my word for it that it doesn't help with the poem, because the poem itself does not have a title. And so I can't tell you which poem is. But yes, I think there are lots of different ways of engaging with it. I'm at the beginning of my journey with context.
Thank you, Velda. This is great. So I wanted to ask about timelessness. So if we think about the best poems or best plays or best books that we love most, they are in fact timeless. We do not love them because we learn more about the context. So how does the literary criticism or education, English education, look at timelessness versus context? Is there anything written on that?
There's lots of stuff written on that in terms of that's how we think about canon formation, and canon is socially constructed. So that poem, which was written in 1819, has basically had no public recognition until now, really does speak to the Policing Act, makes it kind of timeless. The last time it had any attention was when it was the Guardian's Poem of the Week in 2008, after the banking crisis. And they were looking at it and kind of the way that things were falling apart then and saying about this kind of prospect. So the thing about timelessness is it's not. It's constructed, and there's lots of stuff about this. So, like, for example, Shakespeare, you read the plays now and you're like, oh, Tell Me the Shrew, it's so feminist. The thing is, in Nazi Germany, they had a list of Shakespeare plays that were really good and powerful and they wanted everyone to watch. You can read the really good literature can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and it depends on the context in which you're interpreting it. It can speak to different things in different times. So, I mean, I think that this poem, I don't know, I like this poem. Is it timeless? Well, it's very specifically not. It's very specifically timed, but it does have resonance with today. So, is it?
We do have a very interesting half question on board, but we might.
I don't know how to do that.
Oh, I don't know either. But maybe while we figure out that, we can take one at the back.
Well, thank you very much for your talk, revealing Steve from the other side of the house. The last time I was taught literature, 1970s, my professors beat to death literary technique.
Yes.
As if everything we read were German Hopkins. Is the current interest in context a reaction to previous, or is it a complement to concurrent studies of the techniques?
It's concurrent. It's definitely both of them. It's not instead of. I mean, you know, this is 15 to 20%. There is lots of other percentage which is about those kind of things, and literary choice, authorial choice. Sorry, is I think the word. Right. I will say the only other place I know that is teaching this is in Victoria, where this poem has been set as part of Shelley in Year 13 studies for this year. So.
Devika's clarified it was a comment.
Okay.
But I was quite interested because it kind of drew on your lit and colour subject, which I thought.
Yeah, can you really malign 19th century England more than the existing historic literature already does? Probably.
There we are. It was a question after all. Well,
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. How that, and I'm gonna go and read the poems. I'm still turning in my mind your idea of the technical puzzle, right? And how that is probably constructed between teachers and learners, right? Rather than arising in the learner's mind. Do marking schemes play any role in that?
Well, this is an interesting question because mark schemes tend to say any reasonable interpretation. So they don't give you don't get a kind of a piece of paper, an exam board, which says this is how this text is to be interpreted. I think part of it is to do with the way that we kind of engage with poetry in secondary school. It is possible to get out of it. We had a student who did our PGC a few years ago and then did the MLT, and she refused to answer questions. Every time they asked her a question about the poem, she asked them a question right back, and it really irritated her students. But she got them out of it. They were the ones who came up with the interpretations. I think it's partly to do with the way that we've been teaching stuff. And yeah, you have to teach 20 poems. You have to teach it quite quickly. I would say for at least the last 20 years, we've been making bullet points next to poems in our anthologies to learn. I mean, you've been through this, right? You've recently seen these anthologies. And I think that it's partly that anxiety, again, it's anxiety about attainment. It's anxiety about accountability, is what do I write next to this poem? And that kind of idea that actually there's a list of correct stuff to write. But also this kind of sense that poetry is more difficult. And again, we have people coming in every year who say, oh, I managed not to do any poetry during my English degree. And we say, well, you can't get away from it when you're teaching it.
Is it okay if we just take one more question from Judith? Yeah.
So it's a question around the sort of the role for interpretation that wouldn't have been possible at the time. We're going back to the leeches. So we now know that actually leeches are antibacterial and they're actually really healthy. But there's a role there for a metaphor that we can use with our modern scientific knowledge, and the role of that. Where does that fit in the teaching of an interpretation of a poem and how a poem might make you feel? Sorry.
No, that's interesting. I mean, it is quite interesting, that question because in this case, that resonates with and supports, that gives a reason for why. Sometimes you have things which you know are wrong, and so now we know that you shouldn't do that. But it doesn't necessarily. I mean, this is the thing about the production of text. The thing about production of text in their socio-historical context, that it's about both the context of then, but also the context of now in understanding it. And I think that most of us agree that there has to be some element to which students can relate to things through their own lives in order for it to have any interest to them at all. And I think that's part of that kind of mapping, that schema, between text, but also between their lives and the text. But that's a really interesting piece of knowledge that I'm definitely going to add to my footnote.
Thank you so much, Madam. Very lovely and exciting, really. I was just thinking about your sort of description of, I've never thought of poetry and literature that way, but context and the text. And I thought it's quite important how it's a political tool, because I studied English literature back home and I read about the Queen and all of that. And without ever being in the UK, a person would know, the rolling hills and the Queen and what England did. So I was just thinking about the political sort of instrumentation of literature in a sense. So it's timeless in that sense, but it's borderless too.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
You know, in terms of, yeah, it can take over, hegemonize, you know, kind of knowledge and minds and power it holds.
Yes.
Thinking about post-colonial kind of contexts and all that.
Yes.
And I see that happening here too, in the teaching of history, for example. Yeah. And how they read about the Queen and how wonderful it was. But it's quite
Teaching of literature.
That's exactly what you could
We're busy doing 19th century novels that tell us about how great the empire was. So, yeah, no, I agree absolutely, and that plays into lots of my other interests, as you are aware.
Thank you, Mike. Can I get you to stand up one more time, please? I want you to please thank me in joining. Thank you. Sorry, join me in thanking both of our speakers. So they've given us two very stimulating and very different lectures that I think beautifully reflect the kind of breadth of work that we do within the department. So thank you for showcasing the work that you do. So it's been a real pleasure to celebrate their recognition of distinction professorships together tonight. I realized the only thing that might have been better if I made you wear gowns. Or if your mother had shared an embarrassing story.
Suggest that she's still there.
No, it's a very wonderful evening, so thank you. It has really given us a chance to kind of take pause and reflect on the achievements and the work that we do within the department and kind of shine a light on the work that our colleagues do. So hopefully, we hope that we'll continue this tradition in years to come.